China's apparently going to beat the US. This is how we lose the trade war. This is by Money and Macro.
How the US was the biggest trading partner for most countries in 2001. But as the years progress, we see the map turn red as China quickly overtakes the US.
I've been seeing these maps everywhere in the last 25 years. Obviously, China is just dominating these sorts of things. Now, again, this video has the parentheses big picture. Is that the key words there, though? I'm just really curious to see exactly what will result out of losing the trade war, the US losing with the Chinese.
This map shows in blue how the US was the biggest trading partner for most countries in 2001. But as the years progress, we see the map turn red as China quickly overtakes the US as the world's biggest trading partner. No wonder...
I guess we're going to get into this. The US doesn't really make anything anymore, which I guess is the things that Trump tries to say. Now, this has recently dropped. I think it's down where like China is tariffing the US at 10%, and now the US is only down to like 30% on China. So maybe we'll see what his point is with this screenshot.
The US escalated an unprecedented trade war against China. But is it too late, or can the US actually contain the rise of China?
It seems like. Now, who knows? We still have a couple more months before we probably get a more clearer picture, but it seems like the future of like a decoupling between the US and China is still going to happen. The only question is, when will the time frame be? Will the US do it instantly overnight, cut ties literally tomorrow, or will it kind of be on pace for the next like 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or eventually after like 5 years, they'll have much less business relationships going on.
Many economists have come out and written that Beijing has escalation dominance and that the US will lose against China. World-famous macro investor Ray Dalio is even convinced that
it's so hard to know what's going on, honestly. Because I can't help but think like there's so many forces, especially in US media, for instance. I mean, I'm obviously an American. I don't know what's going on because there's so many forces in US media that's just like overall anti-Trump that they don't cover the Chinese pain of the whole thing either. Like, obviously you can't go 2 seconds without hearing the bad things that are happening in the US, but I don't know where you can really go to hear about what's going on in China. It's harder to figure out how this is affecting them. I've heard stories, I've heard, lots of things that could be happening, but I don't really know, because obviously both sides are being affected here. I guess you have to gather as much information on both sides as humanly possible and then try to come up with, some sort of middle ground of truth.
That what we are seeing today is a classic pattern of how a rising power displaces an old hegemon.
This is what I'm excited to talk about, though, because historically this has happened quite often, and seeing the comparisons here of how the US could be maybe what happened to the British Empire, or maybe more recently the Soviet Union, because remember, it is actually unprecedented the last like 30 years, just the US kind of having complete dominance, being like the #1 power in the world. There were different times, especially during like the 18th century, where the British Empire was, I think, pretty clearly the #1 empire, the #1 power. They were dominant for a little bit, and then it's kind of a waving motion. But will we see the US go down?
First through trade, and then by replacing its currency as the global reserve currency. If that happens, the dollar will collapse and the US will find itself much poorer, unable to pay for its global military presence, while China will suddenly see its power multiply.
That is what that's the whole, fundamentals of BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then all the expansion nations that also join. I mean, these are just a bunch of countries that are coming together saying like, hey, we don't want the US dollar as the global, currency. So that I could see possibly happening in the multipolar world that it seems like we're entering. That feels inevitable, that we will stop having the US dollar be as dominant. And
yet, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that
if you look at the history of the trade negotiations, we are the deficit country. What do we lose by the Chinese raising tariffs on us? We export 1/5 to them of what they export to us. So that is a losing hand for them.
I don't think that a lot of people talk about that enough. I saw a crazy statistic that Ireland buys way more of US products than China does buy US products. Like, absolutely insane. And Ireland has like 5 million people. China's got 1.5 billion, supposedly. So China doesn't really buy our stuff.
And actually, Bessent may be correct. People like Dalio, who argue for the rise of China, often don't take into account how unique the role of the US dollar is today. Now that is no longer backed by gold. On top of that, when I studied the rise and fall of hegemons over 400 years, I found...
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to talk about like Nixon in the 70s. I think it was Nixon like getting gold, like US dollar off of like gold backed. Like the US dollar used to be backed by gold, and then he's like, now we're not doing that anymore, and then things kind of got out of whack.
Plenty of cases where dominant powers managed to contain rising rivals. For example, Britain contained an industrial superior Germany. In 1914, and the US arguably contained a rapidly rising Japan in the late 80s through tariffs and the currency.
That's what I'm excited to talk about. Yes, I mean, overall, when it comes to so many conflicts, well, you know, Japan and the U.S. didn't directly compete in a war, obviously. Well, in World War II they did, but not in the 80s. It basically comes down to just like wanting to reorder the world power rankings in a way. I mean, that's really what the world wars were all about. The Brits were very worried about a rising Germany in World War I and in World War II.
Currency deal. So,
especially World War I,
actually has the stronger hand today to win this trade war and become the new global hegemon?
It's hard to say.
The only way to answer that question is to do a proper deep dive into the rise and fall of global hegemons.
Oh,
in this
yes.
book,
Here
Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, famous macro investor Ray Dalio attempted to plot the relative economic and military power of the world's most powerful countries into a single index. It looks like this.
Ooh, the relative standing of great empires. Obviously, the U.S. didn't really become great until like after the World Wars, for instance. Just look at the Chinese explosion, though. Obviously, they had a civil war. They had a bunch of their stuff destroyed. Then you had like the Great Leap Forward by Mao. But as you can see, things are getting really close. The UK really drops down after they lose their empire. Look at how high the Netherlands were back in the day.
It shows us that in the 17th century, the Netherlands quickly rose to become the world's most powerful nation, overtaking Spain and China. Then it shows that the United Kingdom overtook the Netherlands to become the dominant hegemon in the 19th century. The US rose in the 20th century and...
Yeah, I mean, seeing that rise, definitely, I wonder if we're going to talk about like how each one of these nations like kind of lost their step of being like that, you know, the de facto world power. Like, you know, Spain losing the Spanish Armada was like kind of the beginning of Spain becoming less and less prominent. I would say this feels kind of right in terms of at least this UK rise when they were, I mean, I don't know. The Netherlands has got to be the most controversial to say the Netherlands was the most powerful country in the 17th century. But let's see the reasoning behind that.
Finally, we now see the rapid rise of China. Based on this research, Dalio argues there is a detailed pattern that can explain why empires rise and fall. But in the past, I've argued that this detailed theory does not hold up very well. However, the pattern...
Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. I don't know. I don't think history is as black and white as it sounds nice to theorize, oh, this is why countries rise and fall. This is why this country was number one, and then this happened, and now it's no longer... I mean, it's really gray. Things are really gray, so I need a little bit more explanation. I feel like... And I'm not going to like it.
And that is, great power first tends to become an industrial power and then later obtains reserve currency status. That is not very controversial. For example, while the UK overtook the Netherlands as a main trading nation in the late 17th century, it was only in 1784 that the Dutch guilder lost reserve currency status.
We're talking specifically about trade, though, I see. So we're focusing on just the aspect of trade, I see.
Similarly, the UK pound only lost its crown as a global reserve currency in the 1950s, well after the US had overtaken it, industrially speaking. Why is this the case? Why do rising nations take the industrial crown before taking the reserve currency crown? To answer that question, we need to talk about gold.
Real quick before we continue, I think that is industry going to be as important in a world basically ruled by AI? Like, is industry the number one thing as we enter more and more? We're starting to see a kind of a clearer and clearer picture of what the world can become when we have like AGI. Like, AI is becoming absolutely insane. Have you seen like Google's like video AI? What's it called? VO3 or something like that? Like, are we going to cover AI at all? And does industry matter in the future world where basically AI just runs all the jobs? You know what I'm saying? Like, how much is that going to affect? It really feels like the world that we're entering is going to be unlike. So whatever rules we made up for the past won't matter like 10 years into the future, maybe even just 5 years into the future. Do Do you see what I'm saying? I don't think that's crazy to say out loud.
You see, for most of the period Dalio studies, all national currencies were directly tied to gold. So one Dutch gulder, British pound, and US dollar could be exchanged for a certain weight of gold. Because gold is pretty heavy and impractical to divide and to carry around, people ended up favoring currencies that were convertible into gold rather than
It's
holding
also why
gold.
like coins weren't very fun. Imagine carrying like 5 pounds of coins at your waist. Like that would suck.
Itself.
I don't want to do that.
However, this did of course mean that the currency issuers needed to convince holders that they had enough gold in their vault to back up all the paper that they had issued. So logically, the nations that were able to issue the most currency were those that had the most gold. And how did nations earn gold? Well, by exporting more than they import, of course. This can explain why historically rising powers needed to become an exporting powerhouse first. Once their superior industries became a gold magnet, it would slowly but surely attract gold from the reigning hegemon. Of course, the reigning hegemon's currency had a big advantage. It was already used by everyone. But at some point, once the gold in the hegemon's central bank would be low enough, that power would face a run on its currency, which would cause it to collapse. After which, the rising power's currency would of course take over.
I feel like an important thing to note again, because everyone loves to pit like a possible war between the US and China. That absolutely does not need to happen. It has happened frequently in the past when one hegemony takes over another, when one becomes the new global power. It has happened in the past, but that doesn't necessarily need to happen in the future. There might not necessarily be a war between the US and China. China could still become basically de facto number one without, ever fighting the US, obviously. Just wanted to point that out because I feel like a lot of people run around with like World War III, China's going to win and all this stuff. Doesn't need to happen.
This sequence of events is roughly the dynamic that Dalio talks about in this book. In a gold standard world, I think Dalio's analysis holds up pretty well actually. The Dutch lost the export crown to the British in the late 17th century, but it took roughly 100 years for Dutch gold to run so low that the Bank of Amsterdam faced a run and collapsed. Similarly, the US surpassed Britain's industrial might in the late 19th century, but it took the US's superior industry slowly but surely collecting all the world's gold and a major war before the US dollar could fully displace the pound in the 1950s.
And that's the weird thing is that, I don't know if it's that weird, but yeah, those world wars really helped the US. They completely destroyed Europe. The reason why we were able to, cement our position as the, that number one power, or at least, in the 1950s, it was between the US and the Soviet Union. That's hence the reason, the whole point of the Cold War. Those world wars rolling through the continent of Europe, completely destroying all the countries on that landmass, really helped us out a lot.
Dalio's model can also explain why some challenger powers never made it. For example, while Napoleon tried to break British industry when he formed the so-called continental system, the British used the power of their reserve currency to borrow money to fund a war against its weakest link, Denmark. In this case, Napoleon lost the trade war because he had not yet surpassed Britain in industry. The next challenger, Germany, fared slightly better as it hit the first milestone, surpassing Britain's industry around 1870. However, then it mistakenly started a massive war before it has...
It's interesting because Germany didn't really become a country until 1871. So you could tell the British were very afraid, especially when the Germans started making big old ships. That's more of like a self-defense sort of thing. Once the Germans started building, a rival navy, that obviously directly affects British sovereignty, because if the Brits don't have the strongest navy in the world, then anyone can come to their islands, take them over, annex them, puppet them, whatever, put up de facto governments, things like that.
Surpassed Britain financially and ultimately found itself unable to borrow much, while Britain used its incredible financial power not just to finance itself, but also key allies such as France and Russia. However, today, we no longer live in a gold standard world.
I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
This clip gets thrown around all the time whenever you're talking about finances, but yeah, I think that key word there, we're going to suspend temporarily the whole getting the gold standard, throwing that away. Yeah, we're 55 years later, something like that, more than that. We still have not put that back.
Except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Why does his mouth move so weird? I'm like suspicious of every video now because of AI. I don't think this video is going to talk about AI, but I know I'm going to bring it up multiple times here in the future. I don't know. Does the whole industrial plant of a country matter in this world where AI is going to be taking over so much? I'm just on this like AI train. I don't know if anyone else is. I think a lot of other people have been, but it's just starting to really freak me out how much things are going to change in like literally 5 years.
Therefore, Dalios' framework cannot tell us much about whether or not China can displace the US today. After all, the US did already run out of gold in the 1970s, and rather than perishing like the UK pound and Dutch guilder did before it, the US dollar became more valuable than ever. After that, US trade deficits became bigger than ever. And during this period, the US has faced 3 challengers that exported way more than they imported.
3 challengers that exported more than they imported. So Japan, China, who was it, the USSR possibly? What would be the other one?
The first was Japan, an innovative rising export powerhouse which prioritized exports over everything else. And in the 1980s, many predicted that Japan would overtake the US. And yet, if we look at the dollar GDP, this is what
over
actually
now.
happened.
Yeah, everyone was freaked out in the 90s. I've always mentioned that, but there's fascinating street interviews of people. The Americans of the 90s were saying the exact same thing about Americans right now being worried about China. Just replace China with Japan. It's crazy. But yeah, they exploded in the 80s, and then they kind of just stagnated in the 90s.
Dollar GDP, this is what actually happened. Next, we have the European Union, which has a significantly bigger population than the US and overtook US manufacturing output in 2003. And it had an export surplus. No wonder that some expert economists predicted it would overtake the US dollar as early as 2015.
I remember my teacher back in like 2008, maybe around there. She was all in on the EU. She's like, the entire world is going to become like the EU. There's going to be an African Union and a North American Union. And the EU is going to take back, Europe historically was always around, having the number one power. There was always like an empire inside of Europe that was the number one power. So she was so sold on the fact that Europe was going to take this back after the EU was doing a bunch of expansions and things like that. And here we are, it's like 17 years later, and that didn't really happen.
However, much like Japan, after a significant challenge to the dollar, Europe's dollar term GDP stagnated. The reason that exporting powerhouses can no longer simply displace the dollar is, of course, that this is no longer tied to gold. But if it's not backed by gold, then why do countries around the world want to keep using the dollar as their preferred reserve asset? Well, according to central bank reserve managers,
the consumer economy,
they choose the dollar over other assets for 2 main reasons.
Because we're just this massive economy that just consumes. So everyone wants to export to the US, meaning it's helpful to use the dollar. Let's see.
The first is safety. Safety from getting your assets confiscated and safety from major volatility, as the dollar is one of the most stable currencies in the world. The second main reason is liquidity. Liquidity comes from central banks easily being able to borrow dollars from either the IMF, World Bank, or Fed. But for many developing countries, it also comes from having access to the US consumer.
Okay, that's basically what I was talking about, that part right there. Okay, let's see.
The most stable way to obtain dollars is to export to the US.
Like if I'm Vietnam, for instance, I'm going to want, dollars because I export so much to the US.
Making this easy, the US has essentially given developing countries an extremely strong incentive to plug into the dollar system. However, as you can imagine, this is no charity. The dollar's reserve currency status has given the US a tremendous advantage. It can now keep a military presence all over the world, even though it does not have the industrial might to really back that up. And yet, as MAGA economists have emphasized, an expensive dollar does make exporting from the US very costly, leading to deindustrialization. This may become a problem if there is ever a total war. And this is why the US escalated this trade war.
I have to say though, he's probably going to get into it, but I don't see how we're supposed to just magically start building things again in the US. For instance, I'm literally in Thailand, I'm walking through the streets, I'm seeing all these things that you just don't see in the US. Like I walked through like an entire block of people just like making things out of wood. Everything you can imagine. Just a bunch of woodwork. Like every single store was building doors and furniture and just wood. It sounds kind of crazy. It was like, wow, I've literally never seen this. There's not a, I don't imagine, no, there's not a single time I've ever just been walking through the US and seen like multiple stores in a row on both sides of the street, just like making things out of wood. And you just go there and buy it for obviously super cheap too on top of all that. Like if someone made that in the US, oh my goodness, it'd be like 10 times as much because those people that are making that need to be able to afford to live in the US. So I don't see how we're supposed to be able to produce things in the US again when cost of living is so high.
So I would argue that winning the trade war for the US means taking back the industrial crown from rising power China.
But
on the other hand, winning the trade war from the perspective of China would mean ending US hegemony once and for all, taking reserve currency status away from the dollar.
And I feel like in that world, things just kind of get broken down into like the Victorian era again, where everyone's just kind of like spheres of influence. Everyone just like, instead of the US maybe dominating the globe, you have great powers dominating their own corners of the earth. That's what I'd imagine. But
if China could pull this off, it could become the new reigning hegemon in one fell swoop. After all, if we purely look at the value of all goods and services,
everyone talks about this.
Not so strong.
GDP, PPP, the Chinese passed up the US already.
We would get this graph, showing that officially in terms of raw output alone, China's economy is already bigger than that of the US.
And now the US sees this stuff, every American sees this stuff and starts being like, yeah, but per capita, the average Chinese person only makes like $14,000 a year versus what are we at like now, 50? Yeah, but I always think like people from the Swiss and Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, like those people make tons more on average than the USA. They say, when you break it down by per capita, things really, where's the divide? Obviously, the U.S. has 300 million people, though. Their numbers are pretty impressive, whereas the nations that I just ranked above them, they have significantly less.
At this point, I do have to mention that there are very legitimate concerns about the quality of official Chinese GDP data.
Dude, we can't even confirm how many Chinese people there are. Like, there's a lot of talk that it's not even 1.4 billion. I mean, what I've been looking into, it doesn't look like it is 1.4 billion. Like, we just said that India passed up China last year. They might have passed up China way longer ago. We just finally were able to be like, we just finally can confirm it.
Despite that, the point remains that the increased value of the dollar, despite high inflation in the US, made US GDP and therefore military might much higher than it otherwise would have been. Displacing the US dollar, is that even possible? After all, before Trump started his trade war, China's dollar value GDP graph was starting to look an awful lot like that of Japan and Europe, going flat. Well, yes, I think there...
that chart says at the end of 2019, does that include a little bit of COVID? But a second note that I'm thinking of too is this doesn't really get into the demographic issues, which, funny enough, the other competitor, Japan, is seriously facing right now. China has got some massive demographic issues, whereas the US will have an advantage, even though China already has supposedly quadruple the population. The U.S. is kind of a nation built off immigration, so we can continue to do that. China's not in as similar of a situation, and their birth rate is apparently far lower, reportedly, even than the U.S. I don't think we're going to get into demographics, but that is going to really affect China's rise here if half their population is over the age of 70 very soon.
Like that of Japan and Europe, going flat. Well, yes, I think there is still a very plausible scenario in which China becomes the global hegemon by replacing the dollar. You see, after freezing Afghani reserves in 2021 and Russian reserves in 2022, many countries are looking for an alternative reserve currency to the US dollar. This has only gotten worse now that Trump has made the dollar much more volatile, and now that it is threatening to close American markets, thereby robbing many developing countries of a safe and stable way to accumulate dollars. In this scenario, the Chinese leadership recognizes this unique vulnerability and also recognizes that their current policies have kept the renminbi's usefulness as a reserve currency way down. Therefore, Xi Jinping now starts following the advice of economists that have written about this for decades and takes 3 steps to make.
I actually have that currency on me now for the first time, that Chinese. I got 100 bill. I just saw that I'm just like, oh yeah, I finally saw this for the first time in real life recently, and like actual Chinese currency.
The Chinese renminbi is currency, an irresistible alternative to the dollar. First, the Chinese recognize that foreign central bankers value safety and predictability. So while Trump keeps bashing the Fed, China's leadership moves to make its central bank completely independent.
That's a cool line.
It also changes the rules to freely allow money in and out of China. Finally, it gives foreign asset holders complete guarantees that Xi cannot sanction you, let alone move in to confiscate your reserve assets if, for example, you speak out against China. This instantly gives the renminbi an edge over the dollar for relatively developed countries with lots of reserves, like the Gulf countries, South Korea and Japan. Second, China's leaders realize that they need to make it attractive for developing countries as well to use the renminbi rather than the dollar. Therefore, they make the unprecedented step of opening up their consumer market to developing nations. This means...
I knew that we were going to get into this, and I was waiting to say this. Here's the thing. There are certain countries that no matter what, they're really not going to want to work with China. Vietnam, for instance, really doesn't want to work. The Philippines, probably another one. There's a lot of tension, especially in the South China Sea, where I hear all this argument. I don't know if Vietnam's just going to want to switch... I feel like, I mean, who knows? Obviously, me and the U.S. and Vietnam were literally fighting not that long ago, only a couple decades ago, and now we're friends. But it's going to be hard to imagine Vietnam is just going to... I mean, there's a lot more history of Vietnam fighting the Chinese than Vietnam fighting America. So I think some of these places are going to want to go down with the dollar just because they really despise China.
They copy the U.S.'s Cold War
maybe not go down with the dollar, but, be a little bit more loyal, I guess, to the U.S. dollar.
Tactic of allowing these nations to protect their own market somewhat from Chinese producers. Finally, the Chinese leadership removes policies to subsidize industry, suppress wages, and control the value of the renminbi. Seeing their wages go up, the Chinese economy finally sees an increase in consumption, allowing for further growth in China. Increased reserve currency usage means that the Chinese renminbi rises, giving the Chinese consumer far more purchasing power globally. And this then makes the renminbi extra attractive for developing nations, as they can now reorient their export growth strategy from the US to China. Finally, implementing these long overdue measures makes the renminbi instantly more attractive than the dollar for both advanced exporters and developing countries.
I could see this happening. I feel like this has to inevitably happen. China opens up their population to be more consumer based, but we'll see.
That need a big consumer market to export to. So why?
I mean, China already is the #1 consumer market in the world, but the consumers on average just don't have a bunch of cash. Also, Americans, is impressive how not financially smart a lot of Americans, I don't know how else to say this, like we just consume, and it's crazily impressive. Like that's literally what financial reports have been saying recently, like people predicting that there was going to be a recession in the first quarter of this year. They're like literally just coming out and saying like, wow, like you guys just don't stop buying shit. It does not even matter. The American people just don't stop buying stuff, and it's crazy.
Hasn't this happened yet?
I just wonder if China I don't know if they do. Like apparently China doesn't. There's a lot of reports that the Chinese people just keep all their money in the bank, and that is a huge issue. Well, especially because a lot of people have their money now tied up in real estate, and that's kind of becoming a disaster. The Chinese real estate market's kind of blowing up. I don't know if they have a policy, in plan to change that, but yeah, I don't know if the Chinese people are going to be able to consume the way Americans do, because dang, we're out here financing burritos now. Like you can literally finance your Uber Eats. Like we just don't care. We don't care if we got a bunch of debt.
Well, the most convincing two arguments I've heard about it are 1, ideology, and 2, power. You see, ideologically speaking, Xi has apparently developed a real passion for export.
That is such an interesting image from The Economist here. Oh, what is that top one? Is that the UN? But yeah, that's a massive China with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So this is kind of the competitors against the US, I guess is the best way to put it.
And not so much for consumption. And
I mean, Saudi Arabia is kind of playing both sides, I feel like, so they both come out on top, but
allowing some industries to move overseas, that's a big no-no for him. Second, there's politics. This entire plan involves ceding a lot of government power to independent institutions that protect foreign money in China. So far, Chinese leadership has done exactly the opposite, seeking more power rather than less.
1949.
This means that sadly for China, and frankly for the world, this scenario has a really low probability of actually happening, in my opinion. Despite Trump's chaos, China is unlikely to actually win the trade war and displace the US as the new hegemon, because its leadership is unlikely to implement the reforms that they need to do so. That is great news for Trump, of course. But does he himself actually stand a chance to win? Let's now
I mean, that might come from it's funny how much history still kind of dominates a culture. I feel like China would be a little bit more hesitant for change, especially because when instability occurs in China, historically speaking, millions die. Just millions perish overnight. The best Chinese rulers are usually just the ones that just kept things going, just kept things from complete chaos, kept the Yellow Sea, you kind of get lucky, but kept the Yellow River, from changing courses and causing millions to die from famine and civil war and things like that. But
explore the scenario that...
So it would be difficult, I think. It's going to be hard for China to embrace this much change that fast, because I don't know if that's typically how the culture in their history works.
The US holds off yet another challenger and remains the global hegemon. Honestly, until Trump came along, it looked like this scenario would happen. China's GDP was going exactly the same way as that of Japan and Europe. But as I've said in a previous video, I do understand that the Trump team still viewed China's industrial subsidies and recent dominance of new industries as a national security threat. However, in contrast to listening to his smartest advisors who recommended going slow and predictable with the tariffs, while copying some of China's industrial subsidies, Trump decided to go hard with the tariffs and follow his hardline advisors while sprinkling his own chaos in between. As a consequence, the dollar has been really volatile lately, and the development model of many nations is now in danger, both weakening the attractiveness of the dollar as a reserve currency. To reverse this, in this scenario, Trump does three things. First, he focuses more on playing golf and less on tariffs. This means that he lets his most competent advisors implement a...
He's literally just stop. Just go play golf. And that's how you win.
...moderate and predictable tariff and subsidy program to slowly but surely bring some strategic industry back to the US.
That's what I've been hearing is more than likely going to happen, is that it is going to be a very slow thing that occurs. Not in 90 days, all this stuff, comes crashing down.
Second, he re-establishes the trustworthiness of the dollar by strengthening rather than undermining the rule of law, by ensuring that
That might take a minute, because a lot of people are not feeling like this dude's very... obviously, that's obviously been a thing, but now, in terms of the world and governments around the world, not necessarily just people, but a lot of governments around the world, even our closest allies are no longer... are like, maybe these Americans aren't trustworthy anymore. That's going to be hard to regain that trust back, I will say.
The Federal Reserve remained independent, and by refraining from annexing or threatening to annex territories that belong to allies. Finally, he recognizes that to grow a bigger economy than China, the US needs talented, hardworking people. So while he restricts illegal immigration, he makes legal immigration a viable alternative. In this scenario, China continues on its current path of failing to rebalance its economy. This ensures that while imperfect, the US dollar remains the only serious reserve currency. On top of that,
basically win by default, just because there's no one else to come up, especially if you if China continues to just stagnate here, just win by default, just be the last man standing, not because we're impressive or we deserve it. It's just nobody else. I can see that being the most likely scenario.
But Trump is helped by the fact that developing countries will sooner or later impose tariffs on China on their own, as their markets are flooded with subsidized products. Sadly, I think again that this scenario is now pretty unlikely, because it requires that Trump completely changes the way that he operates. This is why I think in the end, sadly, we have to answer our main question, who will win the trade war, by talking about the most likely scenario. Nobody wins the trade war. In this scenario, Trump's chaos will continue to make the dollar less attractive, but
I kind of am going back a lot to the first term that Trump served. I don't know if anyone else remembers it this way, but I feel like there was a lot of chaos in 2017, 2018, slightly less. By 2019, I feel like things are just kind of back to normal. again. And I wonder if that's the same thing that's going to happen. 2020 is obviously different because of the stuff, the thing, the incident of 2020. But I really wonder if that same thing's going to play out here where there's chaos right now. And then like next year and the year following, it kind of just like, I don't know if anyone else thinks that, but it kind of felt like it was just there. It didn't seem on the forefront. There wasn't all this, things had stabled out a little bit, but
because
I don't know.
Xi is unwilling to rebalance the Chinese economy, there will not be a credible alternative. Therefore, we get stuck in a world where there are essentially 3 big global export clusters:
EU,
China, Europe, and the US. In this scenario, China remains the biggest exporter, but it is not dominant enough to set the rules of the game for everyone. In this scenario, there are also still 3 big import clusters. But again, while the US remains the biggest, it is not big enough to allow it to convince all other countries to join.
The way this diagram is set up, maybe you have the EU and China work together, then you guys could probably beat the US, but that's just the way this diagram is kind of showing it.
In completely blocking out China from the global economy.
Look at that arrow from Vietnam. Like, boom, Vietnam seemingly, man, wouldn't it be nice just to go straight to China? Now they're going all the way to the US because they're not trying to mess with this Chinese ball right here.
To join it in completely blocking out China from the global economy. And sadly, while this may sound like a continuation of the global order that we have right now, a new field of economics, geoeconomics, teaches us that Trump's trade war is a sign that the hegemonic power of the US is now in question.
We are moving
absolutely to a multipolar world.
Definitely. I'm glad you put that. I definitely believe that. I agree with that.
And that has made
it feels like we're afraid. I'm not going to lie. It feels like there were some powers in the US that are on the top that are actually very nervous, and that's why this is all going down.
Implications for what the global economy will look like when it comes to investments, inflation, currencies, trade wars.
Interesting that South Korea is not labeled here. Like they're not in green, they're not anything.
More. But what the multipolar global economy in which nobody actually wins the trade war will look like, that will be the topic of my next video. So subscribe and hit the bell icon if you want to make sure that you don't miss it.
Sounds pretty good.
And to get an idea about the new global order before that video comes out, I highly recommend you check out the following 3 articles from our advertising sponsor, The Economist. First, check out this super interesting article about Trump's tariffs and how they are starting to hammer Chinese exporters.
That is interesting. Because I'm hearing like factories are shutting down in China, and there's factories that are like revolting, not like with pitchforks and things like that. They're just
Then
angry.
This article about why Trump's reindustrialization plans will not work. And then finally this one about which countries' stock markets have benefited and lost from Trump's tariff chaos.
That's another interesting. Well, I mean, you have EU defense is still pretty high up there. EU defense is going pretty good
so far. Indeed, if you want to read all of these super interesting analysis and more, then I highly recommend you use the link below to get yourself an annual subscription to The Economist for a 20% discount.
I mean, I think one of the biggest things is this is going to be a topic that does not go away anytime soon. More than likely, we are going to be 5 years into the future, and we're still going to be talking about this. I don't think there's going to be a clear, maybe in 10 years, but it doesn't feel like this conversation is ever going to go away. And it's not obviously going to be overnight. We're not going to be here tomorrow or a year from now being like, oh, the US won, oh, China won. It's going to be kind of gray. And then the answer is going to kind of begin to shine, and a couple more months will pass. Maybe another full year will pass. And then it's like, okay, we have a definite answer. But I do overall agree with that sentiment that probably nobody is going to win, more than likely. China has a lot of problems they have to overcome. The US has a lot of problems to overcome. I think things just are left in this limbo for quite a long time. It's going to be tough. It's going to be tough, but I'll definitely be here to cover it, so please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Big old thanks to my patrons over at Patreon. Come out here calling bro a history expert. Tambre, Drew's Argentinian Trust Fund, NordTyrol, Nolan, Miglu the Goat, LuxembourgLover, KirinoIsBestGirl, KingBearHaze, Fredrik Tibblin, DOOCHBAGGINS, Pavlik, Carmel Saida, AlexandertheTerrible. If you'd like your name here, check out that link in the description down below to patreon.com.